In January 1944, on the Anzio beachhead, American gunners of the 697th and 698th Field Artillery Battalions wheeled a weapon into action that nobody on the German side had a real answer for. It weighed almost 33 tons in firing position and needed a dedicated prime mover. Yet once set up, its singular task was surgical destruction. On paper, none of its cumbersome characteristics sound like a war-winning formula. In practice, the 240mm Howitzer M1, nicknamed the Black Dragon by the men who served it, became one of the few purely conventional artillery pieces of the Second World War that could reliably do something almost nothing else in the Allied arsenal could: reach out to a specific, individually identified bunker from 10 or more miles away and simply erase it. The story of how that gun came to exist starts with an uncomfortable admission the U.S. Army made to itself in the years just before Pearl Harbor. American planners studying the fortification systems Germany, France, and other European powers had built between the wars concluded that the country's existing heavy artillery, even the well-regarded 155mm Long Tom, could damage a modern reinforced concrete bunker without reliably destroying it. The Army's actual heaviest mobile gun at that point was a holdover from the First World War, the 240mm M, 1918, a French-designed piece the U.S. had scaled down and adapted through the Schneider Company late in that earlier war, so troubled that its very first proof round exploded during testing in 1918, delaying the entire program while engineers investigated the failure and redesigned the weapon from the breech outward. Production didn't actually resume until the mid-1920s. Well after the war it was meant for had ended, and the roughly 330 examples eventually built never fully earned the confidence of the officers who inherited them 2 decades later. A heavy, cumbersome design nobody wanted to still be relying on if a second major war arrived. Design work on a genuine replacement began in the late 1930s and accelerated once war looked unavoidable, running alongside a parallel program for an 8-inch gun sharing the same split-trail carriage, a pairing that followed the Ordnance Department's standard practice of matching a long-barreled, high-velocity gun with a shorter, higher trajectory howitzer of similar caliber, and one that caused no small amount of confusion at the time, since the two weapons looked broadly similar on paper, but performed very differently in practice. The 8-inch gun, despite sharing so much hardware with its heavier cousin, never quite lived up to expectations in Army testing. The 240mm howitzer did, and by the time both were standardized in 1943, it was clear which of the two designs the Army actually wanted more of. Production began at WWII Arsenal in New York in November 1942, and the weapon was formally standardized in May 1943. A gun firing a 360-pound shell out to roughly 14 miles, mounted on a split-trail carriage that had to be transported in pieces on separate wagons and assembled on site with a dedicated crane, the same basic arrangement used for the Army's 8-inch gun. By the time production ended in 1945, WWII had built exactly 315 of them, a genuinely small production run by the standards of American wartime manufacturing, which tells you something important right at the start. This was never a mass-issue weapon meant to blanket the front. It was a specialist tool, held at Army level and moved specifically to wherever a fortified position needed to disappear. Building that small run of guns turned out to be a genuine labor crisis for the arsenal that made them. WWII's own workforce hemorrhaged experienced machinists to the draft and to voluntary enlistment throughout the war. By its end, roughly 2,600 arsenal employees had left for military service, a serious drain on a factory floor that depended on precisely the kind of skilled labor hardest to replace quickly. The arsenal's commander, General Alexander Gillespie, responded first by hiring women to fill the gap. By December 1942, close to 2,900 women made up nearly a third of WWII's entire workforce, running the same large-bore machining operations the departing men had handled. When that still wasn't enough, the arsenal brought on roughly 200 so-called commandos, high school students, homemakers, and workers already employed elsewhere. willing to put in 6 evening shifts a week, plus full weekend days on top of their regular obligations. To maintain strict quality tolerances across round-the-clock shifts, the plant introduced specialized master gauges and precision boring bars, ensuring that every barrel liner met exact metallurgical standards despite the rapid turnover of floor personnel. That first combat test came at Anzio in January 1944, where the Fifth Army had a very particular problem the 240 was built to solve. German forces ringing the beachhead had spent months converting the surrounding hills into a genuine fortress system, and worse, they were shelling the Allied beachhead itself with a pair of massive German railway guns nicknamed Anzio Annie by the American troops on the receiving end. 283mm K5 pieces, each roughly 90 feet long, including its railway carriage, capable of hurling a shell more than 30 miles from positions well behind the German lines, far enough back that locating them at all, let alone silencing them, had proven close to impossible with anything else available in the theater. The two guns, moved periodically between prepared rail tunnels to avoid detection, became something close to a psychological fixture of the siege for the troops trapped on the beachhead below them. The 240s, alongside the newer 8-inch guns brought in that spring, were assigned to counter these long-range positions, leveraging aerial spotter planes from the 36th Infantry Division to map concealed battery emplacements. By employing high-angle fire trajectories, the heavy howitzers systematically neutralized observers in the outer ring of fortifications, forcing the rail mounts to retreat deeper into concealment and permanently reducing their rate of fire against Allied landing docks. Its most famous moment came a few months later and a short distance north, at Monte Cassino. The battle for the Gustav Line had already ground on for months by the spring of 1944, anchored by German positions dug into the mountain below the ancient Benedictine monastery, crowning its summit, founded in the 6th century and one of the most significant religious sites in Western Europe. On February 15, 1944, in one of the most controversial Allied decisions of the entire Italian campaign, more than 200 bombers reduced the monastery itself to rubble in a single raid, on the belief, later disputed by historians, since German forces had reportedly avoided occupying the building itself out of respect for its cultural significance before the bombing, that German troops were using it as an observation post. The raid failed to dislodge the defenders, who simply moved into the rubble the bombing had created and kept fighting from it, arguably making the position harder to dig out of rather than easier. 12 240mm howitzers were part of the artillery brought to bear on the Gustav Line's wider bunker network that spring, used specifically against reinforced positions built into the mountainside that conventional bombing and lighter artillery had already failed to crack. Army records from the Italian campaign describe the weapon's combination of firepower and accuracy as a decisive factor in finally cracking fortifications that had resisted repeated assaults, a judgment senior Fifth Army officers reportedly shared at the time. Major General Alfred Gruenther, serving as Fifth Army's Chief of Staff through the Apennines, fighting that followed Rome's capture, considered the 240 the single most generally useful artillery piece available to the Army for exactly that reason. What actually made the gun this effective against concrete, rather than just loud, comes down to fairly straightforward physics, married to a genuinely difficult manufacturing problem. Its standard high-explosive shell packed close to 50 pounds of TNT into a 360-pound body, launched at a muzzle velocity above 2,000 feet a second. Enough kinetic energy on impact, concentrated into a fairly small area, to generate pressures well beyond what standard wartime concrete could resist, and a fuse timed to let the shell bury itself several feet into a bunker's mass before detonating, so the explosion did its damage from inside the structure rather than simply chipping the surface. Getting a shell that heavy to survive that kind of impact, arm correctly, and still detonate with precise timing was itself a manufacturing challenge most of the belligerent powers struggled with somewhere in their own heavy ordnance programs. American quality control on the 240's ammunition line held up well enough across the war, that the weapon developed a reputation among its own crews for genuine mechanical reliability, at a caliber where several other nations' comparable programs suffered chronic quality problems. Operating the gun itself was as much a logistics exercise as a gunnery one. The 14-man crew divided into distinct roles: a chief of section running the piece, a gunner and assistant gunner handling the actual laying of the barrel, several men dedicated purely to moving and loading the 360-pound shells, a separate team running the small crane needed to lift each round into the breech, and still others managing the separate bagged powder charges loaded behind it, since the 240 fired as a bag charge weapon rather than with a single fixed cartridge. Because no human being could simply lift and ram a shell the heavy by hand, every round had to be craned into position, guided into the breech, and rammed home before the crew could even begin loading the powder charge behind it, a sequence that, even for a well-drilled crew working efficiently, took the better part of a minute and a half from start to finish, which is part of why the gun's maximum rate of fire topped out at only about 1 round a minute even under ideal conditions, with a more realistic, sustained pace closer to 1 round every 2 minutes across a longer engagement. It functioned in practice closer in spirit to a very large sniper rifle than to a conventional field gun, spraying an area with volume. The fire control system built around the gun mattered just as much as the shell itself, and it's the part of this story that tends to get skipped over in favor of the explosions. American artillery by 1944 had spent nearly 3 years refining a fire direction center system that let forward observers, positioned well ahead of the guns themselves, call in precise coordinates that trained personnel back at the battery could translate into a firing solution using graphical tables and basic calculation, a genuinely modern targeting pipeline for the period, and one that meant a 240mm round could, in reasonably favorable conditions, be landing on a specific identified target within a few minutes of a forward observer's call. Forward command posts used specialized SCR-608 radio networks and sound ranging detachments to triangulate enemy muzzle flashes, allowing battery calculators to continuously refine azimuth and elevation angles before a single trial shell left the barrel. By the autumn of 1944, the gun had followed the American advance into direct action against the West Wall, the Siegfried Line, a fortified belt running roughly the length of Germany's western border that German engineers had spent years before the war reinforcing with thousands of individual pillboxes and bunkers. The system had been built in stages beginning in the mid-1930s and expanded again just before the war, eventually running several hundred miles from the Netherlands down to Switzerland, with individual positions ranging from small infantry pillboxes with walls a few feet thick up to substantial command bunkers and observation posts with considerably heavier reinforced roofs, a defensive network German planners had genuinely believed going into the war would make any direct assault at the western border prohibitively costly. Battalions equipped with the 240 supported the fighting around Aachen, the first German city to fall to the Allies, taken after brutal house-to-house combat in October 1944, and later the reduction of the fortress ring around Metz, a city whose surrounding forts dated back in some cases to the previous century and had been steadily modernized since, using the same basic approach that had worked in Italy: identify a specific hardened position, put concentrated, accurate fire directly onto it, and move to the next one. The weapon also proved adaptable to terrain nobody had originally designed it for. High-angle fire allowed crews to drop shells nearly vertically onto positions dug into reverse slopes in the wooded, mountainous country of the Vosges, and later the Hürtgen forest, ground where flatter trajectory weapons simply couldn't reach targets shielded by the terrain itself. German defensive doctrine by late 1944 was already shifting in response to the broader weight of Allied firepower, rather than any single weapon. Official directives from that period increasingly emphasized dispersed field positions with overhead cover suited to conventional artillery rather than the elaborate, permanently sited bunker networks that had defined earlier German fortification thinking. a genuine doctrinal reversal from decades of Prussian and Wehrmacht engineering tradition that had treated static, heavily reinforced positions as the gold standard of defense. By early 1945, the gun was supporting the crossing of the Rhine. Operation Plunder, Montgomery's set-piece assault across the river on the night of March 23, 1945, preceded by one of the heaviest artillery preparations of the entire Western campaign, and the subsequent reduction of the Ruhr pocket that April, where German industrial cities converted into defensive strongpoints, factories with walls thick enough to function as improvised fortresses, found themselves facing a weapon originally designed to crack purpose-built bunkers rather than repurposed civilian infrastructure. The Ruhr encirclement that followed trapped an entire German army group under Model's command. And while the collapse there owed far more to fuel shortages, air superiority, and simple encirclement than to any single artillery piece, heavy batteries were crucial in systematically dismantling hardened flak towers, reinforced railway depots, and steel-reinforced factory cellars. The Howitzer's role in these final campaigns was less about any single dramatic breakthrough than about a steady, unglamorous grind. Identify hardened positions blocking in advance, bring the 240s forward, and remove the obstacle in a way infantry alone would have paid a much steeper price to achieve. The weapon never stayed exclusively American either. A small batch of 13 guns went to British forces during the war itself under Lend-Lease, supplementing the Royal Artillery's own heavy pieces in a theater where every available large-caliber gun had genuine value, though the 240 remained overwhelmingly an American crude weapon throughout its combat history, concentrated most heavily in the Italian campaign where it first proved itself. I don't think that the psychological side of this weapon's story is something a documentary can responsibly quantify with the kind of precise statistics that circulate online. Figures claiming exact percentages of German veterans suffering specific named phobias decades later, drawn from studies that don't actually appear to exist in any suitable form. What can be said honestly, and what period accounts and post-war unit histories do support in general terms, is that German troops on the receiving end of 240mm fire consistently described something qualitatively different from ordinary artillery bombardment. Positions they had been told were essentially safe, disappearing without warning, at a range where they never heard the gun that killed them before the shell arrived. That's a real and well-documented psychological effect of counter-fortification weapons generally, and there's no need to dress it up with invented case studies to make the point land. The gun's own crews paid a real, if less dramatic, price for operating it. Forward observers directing 240mm fire worked from exposed positions near the front line, often well ahead of their own infantry, identifying targets and adjusting fire under exactly the kind of scrutiny that made them priority targets themselves, a genuinely dangerous specialty within an already dangerous branch of service, since a forward observer effective enough to keep directing accurate fire onto German positions was, by definition, someone German counterfire teams had every incentive to locate and eliminate first. The gun crews back at the battery dealt with a different, quieter cost. The concussion of firing a weapon this large, repeated across months of sustained operations, left a documented legacy of hearing damage among veterans of these battalions that post-war Veterans Administration records reflect in general terms, even without the precise statistics sometimes attached to the claim. Crews also rotated positions during sustained firing wherever possible, a standard practice for heavy artillery generally meant to spread the physical toll of repeated concussion and the sheer manual labor of moving 360-pound shells across as many hands as the crew could spare, rather than letting any single man absorb the cumulative strain of an entire engagement's worth of rounds. The gun's own awkwardness, that 8-hour setup, the separate trailers, the dedicated crane, eventually prompted the Army to try solving the mobility problem outright rather than just working around it. In March 1945, with an invasion of the Japanese home islands still being planned as Operation Downfall, Ordnance ordered a self-propelled version, the T-92 Howitzer motor carriage, which mounted the 240mm gun directly onto a lengthened M26 Pershing tank chassis, armored up to about an inch thick and powered by a Ford V8 engine good for roughly 15 miles an hour. The idea was straightforward. Give the gun tank-like mobility for exactly the kind of dug-in island fortifications American planners expected to face across the Pacific, without the hours-long emplacement process that made the towed version vulnerable to counter battery fire in the meantime. The first pilot vehicle wasn't finished until July 1945, and Japan's surrender in August canceled the invasion it had been built for before a single T-92 ever left American soil. Only 5 were completed in total, none saw combat, and the whole program quietly folded. A fairly ordinary end for a piece of hardware whose entire justification for existing has been a battle that, in the end, never had to be fought. The underlying military logic that justified investing so heavily in a weapon this specialized and this cumbersome was, at bottom, an arithmetic problem. Every Allied commander in Italy and later in Germany understood from bitter experience. A fortified bunker network, defended by even a modest garrison with interlocking fields of fire, could inflict grossly disproportionate casualties on infantry ordered to assault it directly, a dynamic that had already been demonstrated at horrific cost in the First World War, and that repeated itself wherever Allied troops were sent forward without adequate heavy support against prepared German positions in the Second. A weapon that could reliably eliminate that same bunker from beyond the range of its own defensive fire, without requiring a single infantryman to cross open ground under fire to finish the job, was never going to be cheap or easy to build. But the alternative, accepting the casualty rates that direct assaults against hardened positions routinely produced, was the actual cost being weighed against the gun's own considerable expense and complexity. Army planners across the Italian and later Western European campaigns consistently treated the trade-off as worthwhile, which is ultimately the simplest explanation for why a weapon this awkward to move and this limited in numbers still earned the reputation it did among the infantry divisions it supported. Compared against what other major combatants fielded in the same weight class, the 240's real advantage wasn't raw destructive power. Germany's own super-heavy pieces, weapons like the massive Karl Garrett self-propelled mortars, firing shells over half a ton apiece, or the almost absurd Schwerer Gustav railway gun, an 800mm monster that took weeks to assemble, needed a dedicated security detachment of thousands of men, and could fire shells weighing several tons apiece, could throw far heavier ordnance than anything American gunners had. What Germany couldn't match was operational flexibility across a broad front. Heavy siege artillery in the Wehrmacht required vast track-laying units and custom rail infrastructure simply to emplace, turning each deployment into a major strategic operation. The American approach traded raw shell weight for a weapon that, while still genuinely difficult to move, could at least be relocated with standard heavy M6 high-speed tractors and readied inside a working day by a well-drilled battery crew, 315 guns that could actually go where the front line went, rather than a handful of technical marvels tied to whatever specialized rail spur happened to reach them. That contrast says something broader about how the two industrial systems approached the same underlying problem. Germany, across several categories of heavy weapons, kept reaching for singular technical solutions, bigger, more powerful, more mechanically ambitious, that produced genuinely impressive engineering in small numbers, a pattern that shows up again and again across German wartime procurement, from tanks to aircraft to naval construction, and that historians studying the German war economy have long identified as a genuine strategic weakness, rather than simply a matter of taste. American ordnance planners generally aimed instead for a design that was good enough, reliable enough, and could actually be built and moved in quantity sufficient to matter operationally, an approach that produced less individually impressive hardware in almost every single category, the 240 included, but that consistently delivered more total capability to the actual front line than the alternative did. Neither approach was inherently foolish in isolation, And the 240 wasn't uniquely brilliant engineering by the standards of 1944 heavy artillery. Its own developmental history included real friction, including the confusion caused by running its design alongside the less successful 8-inch gun program, and years lost redesigning its own predecessor after a catastrophic testing failure in 1918. What the 240 had going for it, in the end, was that it worked reliably, arrived in useful numbers, and was backed by a fire control system precise enough to make every individual shell count for something specific, rather than simply adding to the general weight of a barrage. The weapon's service life ran considerably longer than the war that built it. A number of 240s saw action again in Korea in the early 1950s, reactivated for a conflict that, once again, involved static defensive lines and hardened positions well suited to exactly the kind of precision bunker busting the gun had been designed around a decade earlier. Operating alongside 8-inch howitzers and heavy artillery groups, they targeted deeply excavated Chinese bunker systems along the 38th parallel. The design's influence outlived active American service entirely. Variants and derivatives of the type remained remarkably in service with Taiwan and the Philippines for decades afterward, a design lineage running from an Italian mountainside in 1944 to Cold War Pacific defense planning that most people who've heard of the gun at all would never guess. The fire direction center concept the 240's own gunners relied on turned out to matter more in the long run than the gun itself. That same basic architecture, forward observers calling precise coordinates back to a center where trained personnel translated them into a firing solution, became the standard model for essentially all American artillery for decades afterward, refined but never fundamentally replaced through Korea, Vietnam, and the Cold War, right up until digital fire control computers finally took over the graphical table calculations human crews had once done by hand. It's a strange kind of legacy for a gun remembered mostly for its size. The 315 Black Dragons themselves are almost entirely gone now, scrapped or standing as static museum pieces, but the targeting discipline built around them quietly became the backbone of how American artillery has aimed at anything ever since. If you had a relative who served in a heavy artillery battalion anywhere in the European or Pacific theaters, not just on the 240, but on any of the Army's big siege guns, I'd genuinely like to hear what they told you about that work in the comments, because these crews rarely get the same attention as infantry or armor veterans, even though the work they did quietly shaped how nearly every major fortified position the Allies faced actually fell. What the 240mm howitzer actually demonstrated in the end wasn't some singular revolution in the nature of warfare. Fixed fortifications had already been under serious pressure from heavy artillery and air power for years before this specific gun arrived, and plenty of positions the 240 helped crack could also have fallen more slowly and at greater cost to other means already in the Allied arsenal. What it demonstrated was something narrower and more useful to understand. That a relatively small production run of a genuinely well-engineered, reliable weapon paired with a fire control system precise enough to make individual shots count, could solve a specific tactical problem, cracking hardened positions quickly from beyond the range of most return fire, without the enormous infantry casualties a direct assault against the same bunker would have cost. 315 guns, built by a workforce most of whom likely never saw a battlefield, quietly closed out an entire category of defensive architecture that European military engineers had spent decades perfecting.